Well, I was asked to talk about this paper we had come out in the PNAS in November, and it's an interesting project, and I am really happy to talk about it to you all. And let's see, but I want to acknowledge my co-authors for the study. It was Alan Taylor, who Frank mentioned, from Penn State, Valerie Truitt from the University of Arizona, and Scott Stevens from University of California, Berkeley. A really good group of people to work with. And the thing I want to do is to let you know that this was not what we were setting out to discover. This started out as a joint fire science project that was to look at fire-climate relationships in the Mediterranean climate area of North America. And that's what we were funded to do. Actually, this project is what took me to doing more collections in the Clear Creek area west of Happy Camp, and then we went up into the Illinois Valley area, and it was our first collections in Ashland watershed and a number of places to get more so we could look at fire-climate relationships. Why the Mediterranean climate area? Well, they're not very much of the world, but you can see that, do I hit the red button? That's all there is in North America, but that's where 30% of the national fire expenditures are spent, is in that little area there, and that's pretty much where you really have fires all over the world. So that's why they wanted us to focus on fire-climate relationships. And what we were hoping to do was to figure out how to forecast problematic years in advance. Well, we didn't do that, but and there's reasons for that, but what we found was even more interesting, I think, and that's what I'm going to talk about. We ended up with deciding that what we would do is we'd take this huge data set that we had of all these fire history studies that we had done in the Sierra Nevada and the Southern Cascades. Now, this doesn't have the Klamaths. I'll show you a little something about them later, but for this particular study. And we thought that if we put all this stuff together, that in a big picture, we would be able to pull out the climate patterns. And that right off the bat, we just discovered that, well, you can see we had almost 2,000 samples on 29 sites, average of 67 samples per site. So this was a big data set we were working with. And then things started to get kind of muddy. And so we decided that, I'll show you. This is when we piled it all into one great big data set. We had to come up with this thing called a fire index, which is a proportion of all of our samples that were scarring in any particular year over the entire area. And you can see there's some years that stand out in there, but there's lots of fire activity going on. And look at these in here and so forth, and then all of a sudden almost nothing in the 20th century. And we thought, wow, this is pretty cool stuff. And so that's our first look at it. And this one here, by the way, this is 1829. And we haven't found a site north of Tahoe in California that doesn't have fire scars in 1829. I don't know what was going on in 1829, but everything was burning that year. So then we decided that, okay, let's see if we can make some sense out of this. And this is the number of recording sites we had by time and over that, just to give you an idea. So this, I found some software that was initially used by some physicists to look at changes in sunspot cycles over time, and then Rodionoff at the University of Washington adapted it to be able to look at changes in ocean currents over time. It's looking at time series for how you can determine regime shifts. And so I thought, well, we ought to try that and see what it tells us in terms of fire activity. And it gave us these distinct periods is what it came up with in terms of what was going on. And when we tried to put that together with climate patterns, nothing came through, which is what I'll show you. And here's there's the periods you can see there. And you can see there's lots of fire activity going on here, but not a lot of really big ones, just every once in a while. And then here we don't have as much fire activity, but you get these great big spikes that stick up out of it. And then it goes back to a bunch of little stuff with very few spikes and then almost nothing. And so was there any climate signal in this? And so here's, we also looked at, that's only 9 sites that go back the farthest, and this is 18 sites to see how robust it is. And then here's where we put in 24 of the 29 sites, and we can't go back quite as far with all of them time-wise, but we still come up with almost the same periods, keep showing up again and again. And so that's one of the things that we thought was very interesting about it. They turn out to be very robust, these different periods of fire activity. And so here's climate indices. Here's the Nino 3, this is an El Nino index. And basically there didn't seem to be anything there that was in relationship to what we saw in the fire activity. There was no changes in it. Down here's the PNA. I don't know if you know what that is, but that's the Pacific North American pattern. It's a pattern of high pressure ridges and low pressure troughs that get set off in it, set up across the continent, and it drives kind of, or as a result of, I'm not sure which, it's kind of chicken and an egg, of what the jet stream is doing across the country. And so actually Valerie and Alan reconstructed the PNA going back some time, but you can see that what's happening with it really didn't correspond much with our fire activity that we were finding. And then down here is the PDO, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which is shifts in ocean temperatures in the Gulf of Alaska that kind of drive storm patterns sometimes and affect fisheries and so forth. But you can see there again, there's really no correspondence with our fire activity. And so we were getting kind of at this point and kind of discouraged because we weren't finding what we were really looking for, not paying that much attention to what it was we were seeing there. And so then we try one more thing. This is Western North American temperature reconstructions down here. And there again, we find there's not much correspondence with our fire activity. You see that it starts out on the low side and then comes up and then ends up here. Well, that's climate change, that's warming. And we see that in the record, but it doesn't correspond much with what we've got going on in fire activity. And then finally is the PDSI, which is the Palmer Drought Severity Index. It's an index of how dry or moist it is in any particular year. And that's on the bottom, and again, there's no changes in it. There's nothing, because we kept running that software over each one to see if there were any changes that corresponded with our fire activity changes. And there weren't anything that we could find. And so that's what we ended up with. And so then it was kind of like, okay, we need to step back and look at what is really going on here. This is another way of looking at fire activity from the PDSI point of view. And what I did was trying to force stuff out of the data, you know, because we were still thinking climate. And so what this is okay, how many of our samples were being scarred in any particular year, and how dry was it? And so this is from the driest year is 0 to 1 being the wettest year in the whole record. And this is the smallest size fire year up to the major year. So you can see there's a pretty good relationship there with when it's dry, well, we get a lot of fire, but we don't need to do any analysis to figure that one out. We already know that. But it really charts out over this entire 400-year period very distinctly this way. And so then we said, okay, let's do the same thing with temperature. And that's what's interesting. Look at that. This is, again, smallest size fires to the largest, or amount of area burning. And this is the coolest years to the warmest. And look at this. It goes on up and then all of a sudden crash. And guess what? When I said, I got to go in the data and see what's going on here as to why don't we get large fires up in here. That's why. That's during the fire suppression period. It kind of gives this, most of the warm years because of climate change are during the fire suppression period. And that's when you would have expected this thing to keep going with more fire, and we did just the opposite. We turned it off. And so to me that was a really interesting thing to come out of this, to see that right there. We didn't end up with this in the paper because they only gave us so much space to publish stuff, and we had to take out some graphs, and this is one that got taken out. But I wanted to show it to you all because I think it's pretty interesting. So let's go back. Here again, what we did was they said, oh, that's interesting with temperature. And so what you have here is this is the fire index. This is the amount of fire activity that goes up and then crashes down. But this is the actual temperature index that averaged out over 20-year periods is what we're, to kind of smooth it. And then this is if you take build a regression model with it, predicting what you would probably get if it continued to follow that in terms of the fire activity. And so it shows you that it follows pretty good what fire activity we actually found until we get to this point that it's going to crash. And indicating that we would have most likely in the 20th century had a whole lot more fire than going on than we did, and even that we had in the previous century or so, if we hadn't instituted fire suppression at that time, early in the century. So it really shows how dramatic of an effect fire suppression has had. So then, okay, we have these 4 periods. How about within each period, what's happening with the Palmer Drought Severity Index and the Western North American Temperature Index? And what you see is this 0 is the year of the fire, and this is like the 0.001 p-value up to 0.1. And so any of these are significant, just, more p-value. And the same thing here. So what it shows you is that in the year of the fire from 1600 to 1775, dry, warm years, you had lots of fire. And then when we go here to from 1776 to 1865, same thing. So why are things different? And then when we go in this period, the same thing. The same stuff keeps showing up as being significant within each of these periods of different fire activity. So climate's still driving things. The warm, dry years are still having an effect on fire. And even here, during the period of fire suppression, it still comes through as being significant. Warm, dry years give you more fire. But when you look at the whole thing as across the board, it kind of gets muddled unless you look at these individual periods. So what's driving these individual periods? And so we end up with these 4 distinct fire regime periods. So we decided we'd do some more stuff with climate. But we also decided, maybe we got to see what people are doing too. And so this is just a correlation of the PDSI, and it shows that it kind of comes and goes in terms of how highly correlated it is or not. That's one thing. But then here, this is what we could reconstruct of the Native American population by talking to a lot of anthropologists at Stanford and other areas in California. And basically what happened, we end up with, at the time of the Spanish coming in, the population clear up here and crashing, and then the gold rush and crashing even more under the gold rush. And then this is the Euro-American Chinese influx of other people into California as it happens. And it seems that it started to seem to us that maybe what we're seeing is an effect of what people are doing in the landscape. Is what's driving these changes in fire activity patterns. And so what we ended up with looking at is that's the Native American period right there. And what you get is a lot of fire, a very frequent fire going on, but you don't get these great big giant spikes. You get some years like that and so forth, but essentially you get just a lot of fire here and there across the Sierra Nevada over time and through that period, and very active. Here's the Hispanic period. And so you end up with less fire activity down here, but when you get fires, boom, they become bigger spikes. And we've actually seen this in other places too, and tried to describe it somewhat, but we never had this big data set to look at it. Here's the gold rush period right here, where it drops down again with the less fire and a few spikes in it. And then we have the fire suppression period where things just totally crash. This is really interesting when you think about it, that this strong of a signal of human land use changes comes through all of these data. Even though climate's still acting on it in the background and so forth, it's that humans made a huge difference in what the fire regimes were doing across the landscape. And if you think about it, it makes sense. The native people's uses of fire, we know native people use fire for a lot of things. And obviously for acorns and oaks, but for many things, there were lots of reasons to burn and manage the landscape well. And in doing that, basically food, fiber, hunting, fires become self-limiting. There's enough fires being used, kind of what Paul was talking about last night, with lots of fire in the landscape. It makes it so that any particular fires in different years, even in the severe years, can't get up and really get to moving because they become limiting because of the amount of fuel. I found one account by an early ethnographer who was writing about the people in the southern Sierra, and he said a lot of people are saying that the native people don't burn for this and they don't burn for that and they don't burn for this, and he says, but they're missing the point. He says in this area they burn for grasshoppers, and he says, and the result of their burning for grasshoppers leaves almost none of the landscape untouched, because the fires, where they targeted, they just keep on burning in the landscape. And he says, so the fire is a major tool in the area for a lot of reasons, but their main use of it in the targeting in that area was for grasshoppers. The point is that the fires become self-limiting, very much along the line of what Paul said, just tried to describe last night in his talk. Then we have the Spanish-Mexican period, where the Europeans come, they bring new diseases, the diseases kill off a lot of people, then they move people, they didn't like the way of life of the native people, they move them into different situations, try to force them into new lifestyles, new ways of eating, a lot more people die off, and so what we end up with is much less fire on the landscape. And actually the governor declared fires to be illegal in California, and if you were caught setting fire, they would punish you and such. And so fires during that period became much less. The fuels then were no longer self-limiting. It became much more continuous across the landscape between fires. That's why we end up with those great big spikes in the years when you have fires. Then we get the gold rush, which we had more decline in the native population during this period because they were considered in the way by the people that wanted to come and get the gold, and who didn't really care about the land much at all, as you can see, and they were just after one thing. And so for various reasons, there was even less fire during the gold rush period than there was during the Hispanic period. And you end up with, for this reason right here, you have tremendous overgrazing in order to feed the miners and in the valley and such, and so the fires couldn't even spread very well. If you read Sudworth's work from the Central Sierra and that kind of stuff, he describes how the fires basically just poke around, if at all, and in most of the Sierra and such. And so the fires now are limited because there isn't enough fine fuel to carry them because of feeding the miners. And then we have this period, which we're all very familiar with, when we all decided we knew better than the people that came before us and Mother Nature, and decided we'd do it a different way, and tried to eliminate fire. And basically what we've succeeded in doing is having less frequent fire, but making it so that the fires that used to burn in low and moderate burning conditions don't burn anymore, because we can put those out, and the ones that burn under severe conditions are the ones now that only get to burn. And so not only do we have more continuous fuels, but we only allow severe fires to burn under severe conditions, and so we get the kind of fires we have today. And so it gives us these 4 distinct periods of fire activity, which to me is really interesting to come out of this. This is one of those serendipity things that finally, when you sit back and quit trying to force climate to come out of it, and you say, what are we really looking at? And it's kind of one of those things that just smacks you in the face, and you say, oh yeah. So what we wanted to do here was to actually take this period and see if we just concentrate on it, is there something happening with climate under the period of fire suppression? Because we know that climate is changing and climate's warming during this period. And so this is an enlargement of that. And so actually within there we see there's a little bit of, starts out in here, drops during that the period of the 1950s, 60s, and then it comes back up again, is what it's doing. And it's kind of, that fits with a number of kind of scenarios that you can come up with. But there are some things happening there. And so we wanted to look at the North American temperature thing here as well. And what we see, look at this, in terms of temperature patterns for the western US. And Dominic brought up the thing about the PDO, but I'm one of those people that I'm not sure the PDO really has that much to do with our weather after analyzing it and analyzing it and analyzing it in this area.
What's PDO again?
Pacific Decadal Oscillation of the temperatures in the Gulf of Alaska, which does affect fisheries. They know that it affects fisheries and so forth. Some people think it affects our climate, but what I've seen like almost a dozen studies of trying to reconstruct tree rings from the PDO and going back over time, and they all come up with capturing about 50% of the variation, and none of them match each other. And some of them will match some place in the Rockies, and others will match some other place, and that. And so I've kind of gone away from using those. And but the temperature index is a pretty strong one, and this is really interesting to see what's happening here in terms of how, even though we are doing a really good job of squashing down fires, climate is actually showing that the warming here in this latter few decades is having an effect, which it should. It makes sense. And then the PDSI, there it is again. So, you probably want to know, okay, what if you did this with the Klamath Mountains? And this is nothing that we've published yet, and we need to look at it a little more. This is very preliminary, but these are where we've collected fire scar data in the Klamath and also North Coast Range. And I put it all together in a big pile and ran the same statistical procedures over it to see what it tells us in the Klamath, because we know the Spanish didn't have a whole lot of influence here. So what kind of patterns came out in the Klamath? And there's what we end up with. It's interesting, and I ran this in several different ways, and what it indicates is that the Native American period actually lasted longer here, which makes sense, and but it's in the 1820s when it turns up, and it didn't wait for the gold rush to turn up. And I'm thinking that that's largely when a lot of the fur trappers showed up here, bringing disease with them and various things, and so it affected the native populations at that time. And so we go through this same thing of during this period of the 1800s of less fire with these great big spikes in the fire activity here as well. And then we go through a short period of lessen, and then down it comes into the fire suppression period, just like it did elsewhere. So we got to do more with this. This is a very preliminary look at it, but it's kind of interesting what we see here. That it's not exactly the same, but it's a similar kind of story. But you can see that here again we have a lot of fire going on, and so forth, and largely probably because of that self-limiting nature. You have so much fire, and it's self-limited as to what is happening. Plus, it is a cooler period as well, but some of it was drought, some of it wasn't, and so you would expect to see some effects of that, and they don't show up so much. There. Okay, I was asked to take, okay, what do you do with this in terms of moving forward in terms of climate change? And I agree with Lenya. One of the things I think this tells us is it gives us hope and a direction we can go in terms of how much fire was once on this landscape, and that it did create the self-limiting kind of thing, and so forth. And we know that climate is changing and going forward. And I've had people come up to me and say, well, hasn't climate changed before? Well, yeah, it has. And it's changed many times before. As the work I've done with Kathy Whitlock in the mountains here and looking at long-term pollen cores and so forth shows that, yeah, it's changed tremendously over time. But one thing is different now. It's never been accompanied by 50 to 100 years of fire suppression before. That's what's totally different. It's never changed before under these, and it's never changed as fast before, but it's never had that happen to it, saving up the fuel for when things are warming. So as we move forward, the other thing to remember too is that an awful lot of our tree ring records come from this period, 1600s through the early 1800s, and this is a reconstruction of northern hemisphere temperatures by Jones et al. Michael Mann was involved in this, and a number of other people that are very prominent climate scientists. And starting here about 1,000 years ago, and then look at what it does here, right? That's what's happening in just the last few decades. This was published in Science in 2001. But this is when an awful lot of our fire record comes from, and look at how much fire there was even then under a cooler period. And so it largely gives you the idea that, well, yeah, we should have expected a whole lot more fire instead of a whole lot less. Now this I found at a NASA website, the Goddard Institute for Space Science, and this fellow was, Schmidt put up this thing where he was looking at decadal changes in climate. This is over the course of a year. This goes from January through December, and if you look at it, it's from the 1880s, 1900, 1920 up to 2016. And so you can see it actually, this is what the year in terms of temperature anomalies from were, and then it keeps climbing, even on a monthly basis, not just an average year basis, but monthly. And if you look at it, the way that I looked at this, I thought, this is interesting, because that was summer in the 1800s. These are the summer months, basically, that you're looking at, which goes from about 1st of June until actually mid-August is what you're looking at as the summer temperature periods for the Northern Hemisphere. And if you look at what those temperatures are today, that's how much of the year the equivalent temperatures are out of the course of the year now. It basically runs from mid-April to almost the end of September for the same period that used to just barely be over 2 months. It's 5 months now out of the year. So the fire season, the period of the year, and we all see this in terms of our windows for doing prescribed burning, it's getting more difficult because of the lengthening fire seasons and so forth, to be able to get the good windows that we used to get. I used to do a lot of burning early in my career. In this time over here, early September, we would and such, and that's almost unheard of now, to be able to do a lot of burning then. And this is what's happening. And then the other thing is, Valerie didn't give up with trying to figure out the climate pattern, and so I wanted to bring this up because it's part of that story. She wanted to reconstruct the North Pacific the jet stream, and see what it's doing and how it's affecting our storms and stuff. And she hasn't been very successful with trying to reconstruct it. And because one of the things that we've discovered, and has just been published by several people, they've discovered that the jet stream is meandering more than it used to. It used to kind of go like this around the Earth, and now it's doing this more. And then the reason for that appears to be that with climate change, there's a lot more warming in the high latitudes compared to the mid-latitudes, and so there's not as much difference between them. And it's like a river coming out of the mountains and then hitting into a flat valley and just starting to meander. And it's one of the reasons that the storm patterns over the last decade and stuff seems to be changing tremendously from what they used to be, and why we're going into periods of possibly why we're going into periods of more extremes. Out of this was Sumaya, postdoc working with Valerie at Arizona. She decided that, well, one of the things we can't do is just look at precipitation. We have to separate out which years are mostly rain and which are mostly snow. And so I want to reconstruct snowpack. And so she did a good job of that. She actually was able to separate it. She was able to take snowpack back for in the Sierra Nevada for almost 2,000 years to reconstruct it. She was able to do it very well from a statistical point of view for 1,000 years. And once she did that, it was like, oh my gosh. She did it in 2015, and what she discovered was that 2015 was the lowest snowpack in the last 1,000 years. Wow. So it was like, wow, this is interesting. And so those are some of the extremes that we're seeing, as you all know. So where are we headed? Fire season is getting longer, but the vegetation's still growing, and so we have the fuel. And so basically what that does is it gives us greater probability of intense wildfires. And because we have increasing weather that's promoting the fires with the climate, and we have the vegetation that's there. And so it's just, I mean, that's where we're headed. It's a perfect storm in that sense if we don't get to doing something in a broad scale. And that's what I agree with Paul of what he was saying last night. You can't do it with just a few projects. And And this is something that I think is really important to bring into this whole discussion, is this paper, which I don't think has really got a lot of press or notoriety among people, and I think it's because it was where it was published. It was the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences, and so it's not one of those places a lot of people go to look, but Max Moritz and colleagues put this thing together called the bounded ranges of variation that I think are really interesting. It's one thing to look at the total range of variation that used to be out there, but what he calls the bounded ranges of variation are where you can identify thresholds and tipping points where things are going to switch into something new in terms of vegetation, forest types, that kind of thing. And this is what I've been concerned with, and Alan, and some of the work we've been trying to do lately, and we have some more papers coming out in the future that are going to discuss this with data behind them as to how some of these changes are happening. But what we see is that we can start out with landscapes like this. This is our study in Hayfork Valley, and we think about it, you have a lot of options as to what you do in a landscape like this. Now you still got your forest, you've got all kinds of things there, you can put some fire in it, you can do different things. And even in a landscape like that, you've already done a lot to it, but it still has some stuff in it that you can work with. But our thinking is that when this happens, you're really starting to limit your options as to how this can recover and what you can do with a landscape like this, depending upon where you want it to go. And you can end up with something like this. And we believe that fire is a catalyst for change during periods of climate change. And Kathy Whitlock was the one that said this to me first. She says, from our pollen data, that's what we see, is that we see major changes in vegetation after we see huge influxes of charcoal come in sometimes. And otherwise, the vegetation seems to be kind of buffered. And so I think fire is a catalyst for change under a changing climate. Because once you do this to a landscape, and then in a few years later it's looking like this, it's going to take a long time for trees to come back up in that and get to a size that they can withstand whatever fires come again. And so even if it might be 50 years till the next fire, those trees aren't going to be of a size that they can withstand the next fire. And shrubs have a tendency to burn pretty severely when they burn, and so it'll take them out again. And each time the fires go through, they're going to clean up more of this legacy dead wood, and pretty soon there won't be anything, and it's going to be converted to shrub fields. And in a single fire, it's probably not a big deal. I mean, if you have 15% or 14% or something of high severity, but it's the big patches that are the problem, that don't have the available seed source. And multiple fires over time, accumulating these on the landscape, can change the characteristic of the landscapes tremendously. And so, we think, in order to get to the size of areas that need to be dealt with and get back to having more fire in the landscape, we got to think about doing that, even though it really isn't where a lot of people want to go. They're using Manny's wildfire. And we think the paper that we just published, Becky Estes was the lead author on it, but looking at the 2006 fires is kind of giving us an idea of what to expect under these kind of conditions, because Eric talked a bit about it yesterday. It was a moderate fire year, and we end up with it was moderate burning conditions, and these are the various fires that we looked at, and you can see how much heterogeneity there was in the fire effects among those fires and such. It's kind of like the kind of stuff that you think might be good if you're using good and bad. And I figure that good is if it achieves what you want it to achieve, and bad is if it didn't. And it's kind of the way I think of good and bad. And here's one of the main things in the Klamath, and we heard some about this today, and we heard a little bit yesterday, is smoke, which nobody likes to breathe it, but it's the advantage that you have here is because of how it affects fire behavior and what it does to large fires burning in these landscapes and modifies fire behavior. And so it allows you to work with that. And so you can end up, here's the Hancock fire, and here's what the patterns ended up looking like in it. And it's burned for a couple of months to get to 20-some thousand acres. And if you look at it, the patterns are, these high severity areas are on particular kinds of slopes, upper ridges and south and west and so forth. And then you have the canyon bottoms and the north slopes. And it's actually looks very much like what we think a lot of the landscape probably used to look like. But it was a moderate fire year to be able to get it in this particular case. And I think that's important, because if you have a lot of fire burning around in the landscape and it's not a moderate fire year and you have a wind event come and scour the smoke out of the canyons, then we get the kind of thing that happened to the Biscuit Fire, that happened to the Megram Fire, happened to the Moon Fire, happened to a number, the Panther Fire. You get that kind of result, which are large patches that have difficulty receding and can also send the fire back through places that had burned, in the last 20, 30 years or so. And so, here's one of the things I want to show. This is has to do with these moderate fire years. This is an index that I've been following. It's the Department of Water Resources for California does this, and they take these, I think 8 stations from Pacific House here in the El Dorado area on up to Mount Shasta, and they average the precipitation daily over time, and then they put together a chart. And it's pretty interesting. This is what the chart, it's kind of busy, but this is average, this brown area. That's pretty much the average from 1922 to 1998. And it's right at about 50 inches of precipitation. And here's the 2006 year that we analyzed. That was the amount of precipitation. This is the wettest year on the record until this one. We are now the wettest year in the record, is right here. This was April 16th when I downloaded this, and right there we're at 206% of average by that time of the year. So it seems to me that this is a perfect year for thinking about maybe dealing with fire in a different way than we would otherwise deal with. If you look down here, these are fire years. They're all below the average. And here's 1977, 1924, they're the driest 2 years. And then we have 2014, 2008, 12, and 2002, and we can pile a bunch of others in there, but then you wouldn't be able to read it. And this is where this was an unusual year, and in many ways, to end up with so much fire. Because usually in these kind of years, the fires all get put out when they're small. They don't become large. But I think that these are the kind of years to use to be able to get back to where we have this more fire on the landscape, to be able to set up those self-limiting situations such as those that the native people were able to give us with the amount of burning that they were able to do in those days, managing their resources. And that's what I wanted to say.